Good morning. This is Bill McLaughlin, and I'm testing this. I just did my show, but it did not get recorded for some reason. Okay, so I'm starting again. So I guess my radio show is going to be 11:30. We'll see if this records. So, welcome to Recovery Radio Week 1. I'm W.G. McLaughlin, clinical psychotherapist and certified IREST instructor. I've been a psychotherapist for about 20 years. I've worked in mental health for 33 years now. Boy, am I getting old. What this show is going to be about is mental health, and for the next while, it's dedicated to public service professionals. And it's all about psychological safety. 13 years ago, I was working as a mental health crisis worker when I had a workplace incident which ended up with me going off work for a year and being affected for the rest of my life with post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, while I was off work, I decided I've spent years as a psychotherapist dealing with my petty trauma and issues, and I would only work in the future with other people affected by their jobs and who had this condition. So this discussion and this radio show, which will be airing every Wednesday from now on, is all about PTSD and different mental health issues related to the public service and to developing a concept of psychological safety. Like I said, I've been working for the past 12 years with only people affected by post-traumatic stress, depression, and those include military, veterans, law enforcement professionals, correctional officers, child care workers, child protection workers, many people who deal with the adverse parts of life the general population doesn't. So Recovery Radio, I'm working on a book, and but I thought with the current state of the world, I'd like to get these ideas out as soon as possible. So that's what this show's about. I've introduced who I am. I've introduced who I work with. And I'm going to introduce the topic a little more. So we're talking about PTSD in the public service. I myself, when I was first diagnosed, I thought, how can I have PTSD? Like, I'm just a mental health crisis worker, and yeah, I dealt with a horrible situation. There was a death and other things. But compared to people who go to war, as I've learned over the last 12 years, there are a lot of it at risk, and a lot of what I have been thinking was confirmed a few years ago in research, that it has to do to exposure to certain types of things affect us. And the greatest thing I've learned in helping in my recovery and working with others, it's really not about our thinking mind. It enters through the body first. So I want to go through some research with you today that was done a couple years ago on the public service. So on almost 6,000 public service professionals, and the research was carried out by the Canadian Institute for Public Safety out of the University of Saskatchewan. Steve Palmer is a major coordinator there, just to throw his name out. And the research focused on dispatchers, correctional workers, all level of police, national, provincial, municipal, firefighters, and paramedics. So people exposed to high levels of stress every day. Now, I would propose to include in there healthcare workers, child protection workers, etc. Basically, any job where we're dealing with the stuff that nobody else wants to deal with, hours and hours a day, week after week, year after year. So, several mental conditions were screened for: anxiety, depression, PTSD, and alcohol use. Alcoholism. So, here are the findings: 44, almost 45% screen positive for a significant mental disorder. That is 4 times the general population having significant mental health issues who work in these professions. So how we understand this and the role of exposure to us and the risk it creates, not only for our mental health, but for our physical health and our families. The big ones for me: there's always threats to our safety in many of these professions, but it's more, to me, it seems, the impact of witnessing suffering, human atrocities, and the one we never like to discuss that much: disgust. So, I would argue, after my research and work over the past decade, that primarily PTSD and many of the associated mental health conditions and behaviors is a disorder of our central nervous system. That is, the mental health issues come secondary. Wrong. Every one of us have a human threat system that's built in. Is the polyvagal system. The vagal nerve runs underneath the stomach, up into the heart, into a little heart brain, yet same material as in our brains. And then, so when we're under threat, this sends a message. That heart brain releases cortisol and adrenaline, giving us the power to fight, flight, or freeze. The 3 big F's we do when we're under threat. It's up to our left brain then, because the right side of the brain has no temporality. It's up to our left brain to make sense of what is going on. So it's not a conscious process to be under threat. Our left brain will make sense of what to do about it. But basically, the more we're exposed, the more exposed. The way our brain, mind, and body work, the more we get focused on threats and how we keep ourselves safe. Some of the prodromal things that are we become extremely judgmental, we isolate more, we get more discomfort by certain aspects that remind us of our work. A key part to me changing my thinking on this was when I understood that threats are apprehended via neuroception. That is, neurologically, but not perception. So our left brain doesn't perceive it. It is just working behind to make sense of it. And this also why we slowly change over time as we get more and more affected by our day-to-day exposure to things which are disgusting, tragic, or threats to our own well-being. So the thinking brain is always making sense after the fact. Ergo the post in post-traumatic stress. So when we understand how this exposure and our physiological responses to adversity, we can start to see a more holistic view on the adverse impacts of our health, not just mental. Okay? And the other thing that I think our institutions, our clinicians, and you yourself, if you're a public service professional, need to think of, it's not black and white. It's not like having a broken leg. It's on a continuum. You know, there are times we do better under stress than not. Sometimes it's because we develop, again, it's unconsciously, we just develop strategies to keep ourselves safe and going. Now, sometimes these are short-term adaptive, long-term maladaptive. So, having that scotch at night to calm down after a tough day, it works for a while. But 10 years later, when it's 2 bottles of scotch and you can't go to work and you can't function in your family and all those things, well, then it's maladaptive. The impact on our health is much so too. From grinding our teeth at night turns into root canals and losing our teeth and chronic headaches and pain. There too is the way that our body copes with stress, trying to grind it away, but eventually it will affect us. The other thing for us to understand is I have many people who think that professionals, institutions, and individuals, that it's one event does it. Well, no, it's accumulated events. And the information I've just related is why it does accumulate it. It also happens with perfect storms. We may be struggling in our personal lives emotionally. We may be not sleeping. All sorts of things which set us up for an event that may overwhelm us. The other thing is our personal histories. It doesn't mean you're more likely to get PTSD, although it's possible from developmental trauma. But there's a good chance you're out there and a very hard-working, loyal, responsible professional because of your childhood adversity. But that can work against us too. The 2 strongest personality traits measured with people with chronic PTSD are high degrees of loyalty and responsibility. So we certainly don't want to remove those people from our public services, but how can we support them and make our workplaces safer? I think we have to start with policy, peer support, education, delivering metrics for self-care for our professionals, and different mindfulness strategies. I think if we can start to recognize that a psychological injury can be treated, recognized, slowed down, reduced, the same way physical injuries are in the workplace, then we can really start to change things. When I was talking about the other views, that mental health is just one, but when we look at it more holistically, there are numerous conditions associated with chronic stress. Diabetes, sleep apnea, heart disease, chronic bowel disease. The interplay between body and mind, accumulated stress will wear down our physical health, often before it gets to our mental health. And what about our social health? So the social costs are often family breakdown because the person becomes so agitated when they're not on the job, or so need to control our situation. I mean, that's one thing that we need to understand as therapists, institutions, and individuals. Because in our work we're so often made to feel out of control, the minute we're in the door safe, we're doing anything to feel in control. Sometimes that means abusing substances, checking out porn, drinking, being angry, all sorts of ways that we just try and feel safe and in control. For many people, it can be obsessive characteristics come up. The other thing that nobody wants to recognize, including our employers, workplace safety insurance boards, is when an individual has PTSD, there is undue stress on children and spouses. Spouses will, if they live with a person long enough, they'll get as many full-blown symptoms. Some research shows that 80% of children, if they have one parent or both with PTSD, will develop depression and anxiety as adults. So the impact on our community is far-reaching. When we think about that 42%, so almost 3,000 of the 6,000 people talked to, well then the actual effect on individuals in our communities, it might be 5 times that. 30,000 people are affected by it. So we need to start picking up the cause and saying, hey, we need to make our workplaces safe for us psychologically, not just physically. None of us will walk into a workplace where there's glass on the floor and start working. And I think if we start to look at the same, we get lots of training on how to do our jobs. For me as a crisis worker, endless training on assessing people for suicidality, homicidality, techniques to deal with that. For law enforcement, lots on how to arrest, know the Highway Traffic Act. But we need to start training people with mindfulness techniques, different policies that allow people breaks, especially major crimes detectives, military, all sorts of ways that we can start to build in policy if we start to recognize psychological safety as a requisite for doing this work. So I've just discussed how things have to change. So how mental health professionals view it, you've just got to stop dealing with symptoms only of, depression, anxiety. Start connecting with the body. Start connecting clients with how they can be healthier and the fear they have of doing different things. Our institutions need to make it, unions, HR people, need to make psychological safety a priority. Now more than ever. How we look at it as ourselves, if you're a person suffering the condition, as opposed to looking at it as a defect or some weakness or some mental illness that came out of nowhere. It's not. Start referring to it as a psychological injury. One that you can heal from, that you can learn to understand, and one that has greatly affected your perceptions. So, that's it for today. The next page is my contact information. Please feel free to email me about anything I've discussed today, any questions you'd like to hear more information about, anything I mentioned you wanted research to support, and I'll incorporate that into future episodes. There you see my email there. And if we're ever allowed outside again, I do public speaking and training on the topic. Cheers. Thank you very much for listening. And please spread this around.